Hello and welcome to Alan History Nerd. In this video we're looking at the presidency of Kennedy, JFK, from 1960 to 1963. Now obviously this is an enormously important presidency and one that was very tragically brought short. I'm not going to look at the assassination in particular, I'm going to look at some particular aspects of Kennedy's time in office. So this is mainly aimed at supporting A-level history students who are studying the AQA Unit 2Q, the American Dream, Reality and Illusion. And I'm particularly looking at the first bullet point of the section, John F. Kennedy and the New Frontier, 1960 to 63, the presidential election of 1960, the reasons for Kennedy's victory, the policies and personalities of Kennedy's administration, and the ideas behind the New Frontier. So I'm going to crack on and look at all those different aspects. To start off with, we're going to look at the 1960 election. And we've got Kennedy, the Democrat candidate, who was running against Nixon. Now, things were slightly complicated by the running of Byrd, who was essentially an alternative Democrat in the South. They were very, very contrasting figures. They ran a very, very close race. We've got the young Catholic Kennedy, who was taller, better-looking than Nixon, more charismatic, far better suited to things like the first ever TV debate. Nixon was far more experienced. It was renowned as a kind of crafty, almost Machiavellian style politician. Though, interestingly, he failed to fully take advantage of Kennedy's Catholicism, which was seen as a big weakness at this time in his election. There are some experts have estimated that this Catholicism cost Kennedy up to 1.5 million votes, and as you'll see at the bottom of the screen, the election was very, very close, and perhaps Nixon could have made even more of this. Kennedy had a far more impressive war record, being responsible for saving his crewmates, having been his ship having been sunk in the Pacific by a Japanese ship, and he swam to find some friendly natives and wrote a message on a coconut, and a kind of a fairly dramatic story, and so Kennedy is kind of seen as a war hero. Now Nixon also received commendations for his war work, but it was behind a desk. He worked in logistics, so not quite the same story that could be told to the electorate as that of Kennedy. Now, as we can see from the numbers, Kennedy won the popular vote and the electoral college, but Nixon actually won more states, and it's particularly the case if we look out west, and we can see the dominance of the Republicans in the mid and far west of the US. So Kennedy won by a tiny fraction of the vote. So we've got a tiny victory in the popular vote, but a really quite substantial one in the electoral college, and this is where Kennedy tended to do better in a lot of the more populous states, though Nixon won 26 states to Kennedy's 22, but that's because the states that Nixon won were lower in population, therefore had a lower value in the electoral college. So a very tight election, and one that quite easily could have gone either way. So why did Kennedy win? Well, he had the looks, he had the charisma, he had the money. His father was a very, very wealthy businessman who was hugely ambitious for his son, and pumped a load of money into his campaign and helped get the press on side, and the press media played an important role in the election, and Kennedy had a good relationship with the media, whilst Nixon always felt that the media were against him. Kennedy played on his heroism during the war and attacked the Republican record on defense, pushing the idea of the missile gaps idea that Russia had far more nuclear weapons than the US. We now know this to have been wildly inaccurate. However, Eisenhower didn't counter the claim, fearing it would provoke Khrushchev, and this damaged Nixon's campaign because the Republicans looked like they were weak on defense. Nixon attacked Kennedy's inexperience and stressed his own anti-communism, going back to the Hiss case. Kennedy had balanced his ticket with Lyndon Johnson, the highly experienced senator, to help counter this accusations of inexperience. So Johnson was highly experienced. He also balanced the ticket in terms of North and South. So This was again something really important, where there was a worry that again Kennedy wouldn't appeal to the white vote in the South. Kennedy won the black vote 70 to 30, kind of proportionally, in part due to a phone call he made to Martin Luther King's wife when King had been arrested during a sit-in in Atlanta, and Kennedy had worked towards helping secure King's release. Nixon had hoped that the ideas of civil rights being pushed by Northern Democrats like Kennedy would lose the Democrats, the Southern white vote, and pass them over to the Republicans. But Nixon's own running mate, Henry Cobart Lodge, promised that there would be at least a black cabinet member, and therefore any potential pickup of this vote was rather scuppered by Lodge. Kennedy's victory was in part due to the first ever TV debate. Kennedy was tanned, impeccably dressed. He had a blue suit which fitted well with the contrasting with the background in the studios, while Nixon had a grey suit which kind of blended in. Nixon had been recovering from both the flu and a knee injury, sweated under the lights, didn't seem to have got his makeup right, showing off his stubble. Kennedy was very skillful, looking directly into the camera. Nixon tended to look into the camera sideways, making it appear shifty. Interestingly, radio audiences listening to the debate tend to favour Nixon, whilst the TV viewers overwhelmingly favoured JFK, and we've seen the movement and spread of TV in America as a massive social phenomenon. 74 million people watched the debates, and therefore we see this new medium having a massive impact in this election. Eisenhower did not properly enter the campaign until very late. Nixon had tried to kind of make his path of his own man, which I don't think was a great idea given Eisenhower's enormous popularity. So Nixon failed to kind of capitalize on the popularity of the administration he'd just been a significant part of. He also didn't really get a ringing endorsement from Eisenhower. He seemed more concerned in keeping the credit for success of his own administration to himself. So when asked what kind of massive contributions Nixon had made, he said he might be able to come up with something if they gave him a week. It really was damning in terms of Eisenhower, this really popular president, is not giving seemingly this full-blooded appreciation of Nixon. Nixon isn't getting any credit for the things that the administration has done that has been successful. Eisenhower also, with some of his own obsessions, failed to help Nixon really. So in 1960 he cut spending to ensure there was a balanced budget, and this led to a recession. So the Republicans had to go into the presidential election with the economy in trouble, and therefore Nixon's campaign essentially gets the blame for the economic situation, which Eisenhower could have run the economy differently at that point to get a more favourable election result. But Eisenhower wasn't running, and therefore he wasn't maybe quite so bothered. There were some allegations of voter fraud, and again, with such a tight election, there was a possibility that there could have been some kind of challenge, but there wasn't. Nixon didn't want to be seen as being a bad loser. There might maybe be a kind of lesson from history there. So Nixon accepts the results, and Kennedy has won. So in the electoral college, it's quite a strong, fairly overwhelming victory. But in the popular vote, it's very, very narrow. Looking at Kennedy's administration, I'm going to start off by talking about some of the key figures. So Kennedy had chosen a highly experienced vice president in Lyndon B. Johnson. He was also keen to bring in a new generation of like-minded people from academia and business and other areas, hoping for a kind of a fresh and new approach. Now, a lot of these figures became quite frustrated with Congress and the political system, where they found that they couldn't just do things like they could elsewhere. Without doubt, the most controversial appointment under Kennedy was Bobby Kennedy, his own brother, who he appointed to Attorney General. There was criticism. I mean, there is obviously the accusation of nepotism in this. There are those who have said that Bobby Kennedy had very limited relevant experience to become Attorney General. He hadn't done enough work in federal courts and things. He would go on to play a very important role in civil rights. He seemed far more committed to civil rights than his brother did, Bobby Kennedy. And Johnson himself said he again was a bit doubtful about this appointment. Sergeant Shriver is another key member of the inner circle. Also, again, nepotism again also happened to be Kennedy's brother-in-law, and he was a key figure in the creation of the Peace Corps, which went around the world, again promoting American ideals. We got Robert McNamara, who was taken from being president of Ford and had taught accountancy at Harvard, and he played a key role in driving foreign policy, particularly in Vietnam. We got McGregor Bundy, who was National Security Advisor, who was the former Harvard Dean. So again, we can see this real kind of intellectual way, this academic aspect of the cabinet under Kennedy. We got Dean Rusk, who was Secretary of State, often clashed with Kennedy, who was far more in favour of McNamara's far more interventionist views, particularly in foreign policy. We've got Douglas Dillon, who was made Treasury Secretary, interestingly, in terms of his background was Republican. And again, behind the scenes, we've got Theodore Sorensen, who was a key figure in kind of the entourage of Kennedy. He was wrote or helped write a load of Kennedy's speeches and ghostwrote various bits of work that were published as Kennedy's. So we've got this kind of mixture of the old kind of stalwarts of the Democrat Party, such as Johnson, and these new men being brought in from outside, part of Kennedy's administration. The key kind of policy under Kennedy was this idea of the new frontier, which was, again, it's fairly broad. It is kind of the equivalent of the New Deal under Roosevelt, or the Great Society that we'll see later under Johnson. But it's possibly even more wide-ranging than either of those. Kennedy talks about planning to tackle the unsolved problems of ignorance and prejudice, of peace and war. He aimed to tackle poverty. He also talked about tackling surplus. He looked forward to tackling uncharted areas such as space and science, and we'll see massive money going into NASA. He called for courage and imagination, linking back to kind of the idea of the original American frontier spirit. So Kennedy was very forward-looking, kind of very positive about the future, America's future, and wanting to break these new frontiers. And breaking of frontiers is something that the US is kind of an important part of its psyche. So Kennedy was really drilling into something here. The difficulty with all this is whether this is all just kind of sound bites and good intentions, or whether this is or was a sound basis of a legislative program. Kennedy doesn't have the advantages, for example, that Roosevelt had in terms of having everything falling into his favor in terms of getting everything through, and he does struggle with getting stuff through Congress. But this kind of gives us the kind of philosophical background to what he was trying to do. Looking in more detail what he actually does, then we've got several kind of key acts that go through. So we've got the Area Redevelopment Act, put $394 million into poor states, creating job opportunities, created 26,000 jobs. Doesn't seem like a big return, does it, on that amount of money? There were issues with funding from Congress, so not all the money got through, and 5 million Americans remained unemployed. We saw the Manpower Development and Training Act of '62 came to address unemployment through training. A lot of the things with automation was taking away jobs. We see over 12,500 trainees across 40 states, but again, really limited impact on this big picture of unemployment in the US at the time. More successful was the Housing Act of '61 that created 420,000 construction jobs, so we see some success there. This isn't really a new frontier. This is kind of building on policies that are already in place. Similarly, we've got the Minimum Wage Act, increasing minimum wage from $1 to $1.25. So again, we see something that's building on something that's already there. It meant that an extra 3.6 million workers were covered, but 500,000 of the poorest workers, and including about a quarter of those, were laundry workers, which were mainly black women. So again, we're still maybe not seeing quite that degree of social justice that maybe the new frontier is calling for. And again, we're building on former things rather than this being something new and kind of cutting edge. There were new bargaining rights for workers on an executive order giving this through to federal employees, and we see Contract Work Hours and Safety Standards Act of 62, and before that in 61 the Fair Labour Standards Act aimed at young people. So we do see again maybe something of this new frontier in terms of improving workers' rights. We see improvements in other areas as well. So social security was increased by 20%. That's a big significant change. But again, it's building on something that's already there. We see the School Lunch Act, free school meals and milk for poorer students. We saw the use of food stamps, which fed 250,000 people during this period. The idea of Medicare gave universal healthcare to elderly and federal retirement benefits linked to Consumer Price Index. However, action to help remove poverty created by medical bills amongst the elderly was rejected by Congress. So we see some progress and then some problems with what was happening with his interaction with Congress. The Social Security Act of 63 led to mass vaccination of children. There was greater help given to mentally and physically disabled people across the states. The Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act did tighten regulations to protect people, particularly most vulnerable, against in terms of improving the quality of what they were receiving. Education was a major focus of the New Frontiers ideal, and we see the Educational TV Facilities Act of 62 and the Vocational Education Act of 63. So trying to improve vocational education, trying to make use of this new medium of TV for education across the states. There was also expansion of student loans and scholarships to try and give access to education to more people. However, the significant attempt to improve financial aid for elementary and secondary schools was rejected by Congress in 1961. So Kennedy was getting some of what he wanted here, but not all of it, and didn't have the full backing of Congress. Civil rights is going to be key in the ideals of the New Frontier. And we get the Civil Rights Bill in 63, but that got stuck in Congress. There had been the Voter Education Project in 62 before this. The Committee on Equal Employment Opportunity was created. There was desegregation in interstate travel, though not without problems. There was prohibiting of discrimination in public housing, but that didn't stop it in private housing. So the Civil Rights Bill will only pass once Kennedy has sadly been assassinated. And so the Civil Rights Act of 64 is often seen as a legacy of Kennedy. It's important to know that it is Johnson who manages to get it passed through Congress, and it is a lot of the stuff that comes through Kennedy's ideas are kind of then taken through into fruition by Johnson later on. We also see an important issue of women's rights, and we see the Presidential Committee on the Status of Women, which was chaired by Eleanor Roosevelt. It recommended paid maternity, affordable childcare, and equality in hiring practices. And even before it put its suggestions forward, Kennedy had brought in an Equal Pay Act. So again, we see some progress there. In the space race, we see some significant money here. So $9 billion is given to NASA with the aim of putting a man on the moon before the end of the 60s. And during Kennedy's time in office, some men were put into space. Kennedy wanted to stimulate the economy through tax cuts in 63, but this again was rejected by Congress. And overall, Congress only passed 35 out of Kennedy's 58 bills. So Kennedy is trying something new with his New Frontier. He's got some people in from outside, a different kind of group of people surrounding him in his administration, but he is largely frustrated by Congress, and therefore maybe doesn't make the strides that he would have hoped for. Obviously, one of the difficulties for us in judging Kennedy is that when we're looking at this, we're looking at 3 years. So whilst with Eisenhower, we're looking at 8. We are only looking at 3 with Kennedy. So things are brought kind of painfully short. And whether he would have had more success going into his second term, if that had been possible, then it is hard to tell. So it's difficult. I don't think Kennedy has a massive amount of legislative success, but he's only there for a kind of limited period of time, and doesn't have in everything kind of in his favour, and particularly as he'd won such a narrow victory in terms of the popular vote in 1960. So thank you very much for watching. I hope that's been helpful and interesting for you. If it has to, please hit like. If you have any questions or comments, please leave those below. If you haven't done so already, then please do subscribe to the channel, Alan History Nerd. There's lots more on this topic and other topics in American, British and Russian history, as well as some ancient history in there. So lots of good stuff for A-level history, for A-level ancient history, and there's also a huge amount of stuff on politics, both US and UK politics, particularly to help anybody doing A-level politics as well. Thank you very much for watching.